The values of the West, equality before the law, separation of church and state and so forth, are not the products of enlightenment, you claim, but they have much deeper roots. How deep?
Well, they are very deeply rooted, obviously, in our experience, our day-to-day experience, but I think they're also deeply rooted in our history.
Historical roots, yes.
Yeah, and in the traditional authorities from which our sense of community derive, in particular the Hebrew Bible and the Gospels. And I think it's a very important fact that the Gospels were written at a time when there was a universal jurisdiction, the jurisdiction of the
Roman Empire.
Of the Roman Empire, and, which was a legal jurisdiction. So the idea of law that you find implicit in the background to the Gospels is an idea of secular law, secular jurisdiction.
The distinction between Caesar and God.
Yes, which is emphasized by Christ in his parable of the tribute money, in which he says, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God's," which has always been taken to imply that our obedience here below is first of all to the secular law, but also in matters spiritual, it is a different kind of obedience, an obedience to the very general principles governing our relationship with God. But the secular law, nevertheless, in some matters, takes precedence.
Yes.
And that is the legacy of that thought can be discerned right through the Dark Ages, through the Middle Ages, right down to the Enlightenment. It becomes more and more explicit at the Enlightenment that that the rule of law is primarily a man-made institution.
Actually, dynastic rulers, even here in Sweden, use exactly that parable in the 16th century to break up the power of the Catholic Church.
Well, there you are. Yes, and I think this particular principle that the rule of law is a secular institution and is in some sense indifferent to religious differences between people, that is a very important achievement, and it lies at the basis of our ethic of toleration. And I think this does contrast radically with the vision that you get from the Quran, in which the law is seen entirely as a God-made thing. It's imposed by God, and the Sharia is an attempt to encapsulate in a set of rules all that has been revealed of God's will through the Quran and through the Sunnah and through those processes which are legitimized in the Quran. And I think this has given rise to a radical ontological division between the heirs of Christian civilization and the heirs of Islamic civilization in the modern world.
Yes. Let's get back to that issue further on, but to stay with the Enlightenment, would you also say that, for example, equality between men and women are not the products of Enlightenment, but have even deeper roots? After all, the Hebrew Bible is a fairly patriarchal text.
Yes, the Hebrew Bible is a patriarchal text, but interestingly enough, it starts off from the very wonderful story of the creation and of Adam and Eve in the garden, in which the natural division between the sexes is both described and legitimized, and at the same time it's made absolutely clear that they are in some deep sense equal. It's not that Adam doesn't have many wives, he has the one wife, Eve, and the relationship between man and woman is seen entirely in dialogue terms. Now, of course, it is true that thereafter, as the Hebrew Bible unfolds, it unfolds as a history of patriarchs. But by the time you've got to the New Testament, that is very much not the prevailing view of what women are.
No.
And indeed, the most important single non-divine human being in the New Testament is Mary. And it's her and her sufferings which became integral to the iconology of sainthood in the Catholic Church.
And then you have the words of Paulus that he's neither Greek or Jew, neither man or woman, but he's everyone in his spirit.
Yes.
I don't know if those are the exact words of this of the James the second Bible, but
yes.
this is a rough translation from the Swedish.
Right. Yes, I think one can read too much of our modern views back into the Bible.
Is that a risk?
It's always a risk, but after all, it's not a bad thing to read into those texts which you regard as authoritative your own vision of the world, because that doesn't simply rewrite those texts, it rewrites your vision too. It challenges your own vision to see exactly where it has come from and the extent to which it has been endorsed by its predecessors.
So, but if we then turn back to the Muslim civilizations and Islamic cultures, there are Muslim scholars who try to motivate secularism and the division between the affairs of religion and affairs of state, also from the words of the Quran and Hadith and Muslim traditions, which are, I mean, they are trying to find the roots of an idea which they like in their own tradition. Is that not a fruitful effort from their side, would you say?
I think it is entirely fruitful, and the more that it is done, the better.
But is it hopeless in a sense?
No, it isn't hopeless, but there is a great problem. Well, there are two great problems. The first is that people who speak for the Muslim faith speak without any particular institutional authority. They're always speaking as themselves, and whatever they've been able to achieve by way of endorsement from their congregations.
Which is inherent in the character of the organization of Islam, since Islam never had a pope and bishops and church.
Yes, exactly. And Islamic law does not recognize institutions in quite the way that our law, being Roman law in origin, does. So that there is a huge institutional problem about who actually speaks for Islam and what is the effect of him speaking for it. But there's another problem, obviously, that the Quran is not supposed to be simply a revelation that has been written down. It is supposed to be the actual word of God. And it is very difficult to reconcile that, therefore, with changes in society which are either not foretold in the Quran or in some way even forbidden by it. And this creates an enormous hermeneutical constraint on what Muslim theologians can say. But of course they still can do this, and I think that is what the real task of theology has always been, to, within the constraints laid down by sacred texts, nevertheless to extract a viable form of life for the human beings who live by those texts.
The Ottoman Muslim scholars in the 16th and 17th century even found a term for it. They called it Hile-i Sharia, which means going past the Sharia, or fooling the Sharia, which was in a way of circumnavigating those constraints that you're talking about.
True, and of course, had it been the case that the Turks had remained, as it were, the leading authorities in the interpretation of the Quran and the leading authorities as the representatives of the faith.
As the Sultan was the Caliph.
Yes, then things would be very different today.
You think so? As the Sultan was the Caliph.
Yes, then things would be very different today.
You think so?
Of course, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire made it possible for those primitive Salafists and the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia to propose themselves as the authorities.
So I mean, you can say that the withdrawal of the Turkish Republic from all affairs religious when it broke its past with the Ottoman Empire created a vacuum.
That's one way of putting it. Certainly it meant that as far as the interpretation of Islam goes, the Turkish voice is no longer heard.
No.
What is heard are voices that should have been suppressed and would have been suppressed had the Turkish Sultan retained his position. That's not to say that the Turks were wrong to secularize. On the contrary, I think they did the right thing. They Ataturk saved Turkey from otherwise total destruction, and also set it upon the path of modernization, which has made it the successful country that it now is.
To go back to Muslims and Islam and secularism, in the sense that, could you say from another point of view that the interesting thing is not whether Islam is open to secularism and the separation of state and church as Christianity is or not, but the more interesting is whether Muslims can live in secular states and democracies, and in states that promote citizenship before brotherhood and the rule of law before arbitrary decisions. And then if you look up on the world in that sense, obviously the majority of the Muslims in the world can live with that. Then what's the problem, you could say?
Yes, I think that that is right. There are Muslims, and Muslims, of course, some find it easier than others to live with the rules that predominate in our kind of secular jurisdiction. I mean, let me just take some examples. We in Europe don't simply have a secular rule of law. We have very specific laws governing private life. For instance, bigamy is a crime. So you are only allowed to have one wife, and any attempt to evade that law in England in the past has involved very serious punishment. Secondly, compelling people to marry against their will is a crime. And of course, needless to say, things like killing your daughter because she has run off with an unchosen
it's actually
lover
a crime in most Muslim
crime.
societies as well.
I'm sure it is. And to the extent that the Muslims can accept these sort of things, then of course there needn't be a contradiction between the secular jurisdiction and their own faith. But many Muslims, especially those coming from places like Somalia and so on, come with a whole battery of customs which are already crimes in our legal systems.
But this is a fairly European point of view of looking on affairs. I mean, we have these problems with immigrants from the outside, but if you consider the larger Muslim countries in the world, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, the fourth largest Muslim community in the world, which do not live in a Muslim country, India, in all these countries, those customs we talk about, or these attitude against profane law or secular law, are not that problematic as we see it in Europe when we meet those immigrants that you talked about.
Well, I think that is actually too simple. If you look at the major Islamic communities and societies around the world, you'll find, first of all, that they're all in some ongoing crisis of legitimacy. For instance, just take Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood, which began in Egypt, began from the thought that secular jurisdiction is a kind of blasphemy, and that until we reconnect ourselves to the not just to the law of God as expressed in the Quran, but also to the traditions of brotherhood as exemplified by the earlier Muslim society, we will not actually be conducting our lives according to the divine commands. And this was taken by the Muslim Brotherhood to authorize a complete rejection of secular order and a violent rejection. Yes. And the Muslim Brotherhood has always been regarded, therefore, as a threat in Egypt. Of course, it's divided into two parts, the part that is regarded as legitimate and the part that is still regarded as criminal. But nevertheless, that criminal side is a very powerful side and feeds into Al-Qaeda, as we know, through various of its leaders. And I think you find all over Malaysia, Pakistan particularly, this sense among many people that the government is somehow illegitimate, precisely because it is trying to rule according to secular principles, and a constant threat to the government, constant assassination attempts, and so on.
But isn't it illegitimate because it's undemocratic? I mean, you don't have the same sense of discussion of illegitimacy in Malaysia and Indonesia.
Why is it undemocratic?
Well, it doesn't. I mean, last time Hosni Mubarak won the elections, he was the last only candidate, and he got 96% of the votes. And Musharraf made a coup d'etat some 10 years ago.
Yeah, but that's a superficial explanation as to why it's
You think so?
Yes, because if that were the case, it would just be isolated and local phenomenon. But the undemocratic nature of the Islamic world is a universal observation. Why? It's because if it becomes democratic, then, of course, gradually the Salafists and so on will take over.
You think so? Most